think we can get underway. I understand Rabbi Gruber will be coming on afterwards, so we best move along. Want to thank Joy and the technology of Zoom for enabling us to get together while we remain apart in the comfort of our homes, but also confined to our homes. Just as a side note, I was curious about Zoom, and I looked it up. It was founded in 2011 by a Chinese American who had trouble getting into this country. He was denied visas on several occasions. He's now worth, depending on the stock today, he's now worth over $7 billion. What I found curious, the reason he started researching, he was an engineer and a mathematician. The reason he started researching Zoom was he had a girlfriend who was like 10 hours away, and he wanted to be able to see her when they spoke. So he worked on this technology, which ended up, of course, as Zoom. And I was reminded, you remember the movie The Social Network with Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. And according to the movie, the original incentive for Zuckerberg when he was at Harvard was to get a line on Radcliffe girls. So he devised what became known as Facebook. Again, the incentive being to hook up with women and find out where they were and who they were. Like all of you, I've been real challenged to get through the day, trying to figure out things to do. And well, I think all of you realize what a remarkable resource YouTube is. I've taken many a trip on YouTube. I visited the pyramids of Egypt. I've been up the Eiffel Tower. I've taken a tour of the Louvre, something I've always wanted to do but never will. I took a helicopter trip around the tip of Manhattan. They put you right in the helicopter and you see what there is to be seen. Yesterday, I saw a wonderful tour. I would recommend it. Rick Steves' tour of Iran, a place none of us are probably going to get to go, but it was quite impressive. And then, like you, I've been reconnoitering Netflix. I've seen Shtetl. I've seen Unorthodox. I saw Fauda. I saw Seinfeld. The latest one, you may have heard about it, is Caliphate. Caliphate is sort of a takeoff on Fauda, which is about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In any event, I've been looking for things to do, and I decided not too long ago to reread all the books that I've written. Now, you might consider that a vanity project, and to some degree it is, but I'm often curious, have you heard, I mean, authors generally don't read the books they've written after they write them. I've never heard of that. Just as if you hear interviews with actors, generally speaking, they don't see the movies that they're in, or they see a piece of the movie in the scene that they were in, and they don't see the movie in its entirety, for whatever reason. In any event, I started to reread some of the books that I've written, and recently, and here's the lead-in to what we're going to talk about today, I got to rereading a book that I wrote some time ago called A Jewish Boyhood in Poland, Remembering Kolbashova, which is the name of that village. It's a book that takes us back about 100 years in time to a place that'll never be again, introduces us to this fellow by name of Norman Solzitz, who will, through me, lovingly recreate the life that he knew in this vanished world, where he spent the first 20 years of his life. And I think the story he's going to tell us, and the story he's going to tell us through me, will be something of interest to you for a number of reasons. It's a traditional Jewish community. Variations, of course, are still with us. You saw it in Shtetl. You saw it in Unorthodox. I expect many of you have seen those films. It's still around, as you know, in Brooklyn, in Borough Park, in Crown Heights, in Williamsburg, in Muncie, in Rockland County, in Orange County. We kind of know this community up to a point. So that's one thing. We're going to kind of get an insight as to what it was like before these people came from Eastern Europe to the United States. We're also going to look at some of the beliefs and rituals that this community followed, many of which, some shadow of which we still observe, and of course others observe them to an even greater extent. And we're going to come upon people who are our forebears, the Ashkenazi Jews who came to this country prior to us, were our grandfathers. In fact, I found out while thinking about this that these Landmannschaften, these benevolent societies that these emigres from Europe founded, there was one founded by the folks who left Kolbaszowa in Poland, and they set up a congregation and a society on the Lower East Side on 5th Street, and I was born on 4th Street. So unknowns to me, obviously, there was a connection here that I only recently discovered, so that there was a presence of Kolbaszowa residents going back, I think, to the late 1890s. In fact, one of the more illustrious personalities from Kolbaszowa were the parents of George Burns. George Burns was born on the Lower East Side, and of course, you all know him. He had the good fortune of living to 100 years old. His original name was Nathan Birnbaum. And of course, we're going to look at people. Norman is going to tell us about people who might have come to America, except for the fact that they fell victim to the murderous rampages of the Nazis. I think hearing this story will also echo quite a bit for all of us, as it did for me. This village is going to sound a lot like Anna Tefka from Fiddler. As I was thinking of the parallels, let me give you a few that came immediately to mind. Tevye, as you know, had a problem. He had 5 daughters, and he had to figure out how to marry off 5 daughters. The father of my narrator also had 5 daughters. And of course, if you have daughters, they're going to be festive weddings. And we're going to talk about this, probably not today, but at a later time, how weddings were conducted back then. If they're going to be weddings, they're going to be matchmakers. You, of course, all remember Yenta. And interestingly, there are going to be a number of matchmakers in our story, most of which actually were men rather than women. Tevye delivered milk. Norman's grandmother delivered milk. The religious folk in Kolbaszowa did not trust the milk unless it came from a very orthodox source who could be trusted. So his grandmother went out to the farms, milked the cows, and brought the milk into the village. Tevye has trouble on a number of occasions, if you remember, explaining why they did things the way they did. And of course, his answer was tradition. And here we'll find that in a number of instances, some of which are quite astounding, when I asked Norman, why was it done the way it was? His answer simply was, that was the tradition. Other parallels. By the way, everyone is muted. Maybe, I mean, I'd like to hear if something occurs to you as I'm proceeding, for you to chime in and raise a question. How would we do that, Joy?
Sure. The easiest way to do that on this version is you can unmute yourself. So are you okay with people if they have something to add, they can just unmute themselves and add it? Would you like them to
Yeah,
raise their hand first,
think,
or they can just unmute themselves?
yeah, I think so. Just unmute yourself and ask a question
Okay.
because it'll occur to you when I'm talking. It might not occur to you toward the end. So
Yeah, I just have everyone muted for just for background noise, but if you have something to add, you can just simply unmute yourself. You should be able to hover over your box and unmute yourself.
Richard,
yeah,
just for your information, the original Sholem Aleichem story about Tevye had 7 daughters, not 5.
yes, that's right. That's right. I guess they wanted to save money on the production. And
Right, they were making it a little more concise, but there were 7 originally.
You're absolutely right. 7 daughters reduced to 5 for the show and the movie.
Yes.
Also, of course, at the end of Fiddler, Anatevka is no more. And at the end of the story that I'll be telling you, Kol Bashova is no more. In fact, when the Germans came in, he was a young man, rather strong, and he was put to the task of helping to destroy the town, or at least the Jewish section of town. So we have a parallel between the 2 stories. And of course, in Fiddler, some of them are going off to America in the last scene. And of course, in our story, certainly Norman and later his wife do go off to America. So the parallels are many. I don't know if we need an update. I was going to contact Stephen Sondheim, see if he wanted to do a update of Fiddler, maybe call it Tumla or something like that.
The big problem, there would be a giant problem there. Stephen Sondheim did not do it. It was Harnick and Bach.
Yes, I'm not saying he did. I'm just saying I'm thinking of a famous.
I see. I'm sorry. I misunderstood entirely.
And the other problem, as you probably know, Stephen turned 90 a few weeks ago, and I'm not sure he's up to writing a full-length show. All right, how did I get to write this book? Where do I come to writing a book about a Polish village in the 1920s and the 1930s? A little backstory here before we get into the specifics. For a time, I was friendly with a fellow who was the basketball coach at Hofstra. Unfortunately for him, his team started losing on a rather consistent basis, and he was no longer the basketball coach. Instead, he became a stockbroker, and he called me one day and said he had a client who lived in New Jersey who had a story to tell. He was a survivor, and he felt compelled, along with his wife, to tell the story of how they survived the war years in Poland. I was curious, but on the other hand, by this time, by the 1990s, it had turned out that many survivors, there was a period of hesitancy where people did not talk about what happened to them in those war years, but that had passed, and now many of the survivors felt compelled to talk about their experiences, and he and his wife had compiled a manuscript in which each of them spoke about how they had gotten through the war. That's another book, which we won't talk about today, but I did go. What's that? I did go to New Jersey where he lived, and he showed me the manuscript. And I was, as always, if you read these stories, they are gripping. You can't put it down. The only consolation is, even while there's death all around them, that they survived. So even when they tell you a hair-raising story, the end is that somehow, miraculously, they're going to make it. For example, he fled into the woods. Do you remember some years ago, we had that family, the son, I think, who came from, remember the movie Defiance, about those Jews who fought back against the Nazis in the woods? In any event, that was part of his story. And as I read the story, I was taken with all of the elements. and also with the fact that he was able to recall in exquisite detail names and places and circumstances. And, I don't have the capacity, not too many people do. So when I saw the detail, the rich detail that he was able to bring to it, I was really attracted to the possibility of doing this manuscript for him. And so I did. I made a deal with him. The deal was I would get this manuscript about their experiences during the war, both of them, if in turn he would go through with me his life as he experienced it in this town of Kolbashova, where there had not been many books. I mean, there were books about escape, but there were not books about what the village life was like. So there eventually occurred this book. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Against All Odds, which was the manuscript that I originally did for them. It was published by Holocaust Library Press, and it is quite an account of their wartime experiences. After that, I began a weekly pilgrimage to Springfield, New Jersey, taping hour after hour all of his recollections. There were very few questions that he could not answer. Plus, remarkably, he had received a Brownie camera, I think for his bar mitzvah, and he went around Kolbashova taking pictures. And I don't quite know how he did this, but even when the Germans occupied the town, he was able to take pictures, often gruesome pictures, of their activities. The question for all of us and for me is, can we believe him? I mean, I have no corroboration. No one else survived that I was able to speak to. So if you were to ask me questions beyond what he told me, I would be incapable of answering it because the source of the information is Norman and Norman alone. But, I tried to trick him. I tried to cross him up. I would ask questions again and again, and hoping he'd give me the same answer. And remarkably, he did. So impressed was I with the richness of the detail. And of course, you can judge for yourself. I think much, if not all, of what he conveyed to me was how he perceived it as he lived his life. He was born in 1920. He escaped or fled into the woods in 1941. So he had his formative years in Kolbashova and would report back to us. And so after about 2 years of interviews and writing, and he would look at everything I wrote and correct it and add to it, a very thorough editing job on his part, there came forth this book called, and there's a picture of his family on the front. It's called A Jewish Boyhood in Poland. It was published by Syracuse University Press. And some years ago, when we were at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, it was being offered in the bookstore. So it did circulate rather well for an academic press book. And it was well received. The reviews were quite good. One of the leading professors in this field by the name of Jan Gross wrote, and I quote, "An extraordinary piece of writing." The Kirkus review that came out with it said this book earned a place on the shelf with Isaac Balsheva Singer and Isaac Babel. So it was a well-reviewed book. So what follows now is the story of Kolbashova, lovingly related by a native son And let me read you, I'll read you a few passages from time to time as to how he saw himself fitting in to this town. It's been over 50 years, but time is not the enemy. It does no violence to my memories. I have little sense of having left or of the distance I traveled. I remain and always have been an inhabitant of Kolbashova. I walk its crooked streets, trail along with those in black coats, broad hats, and long beards, as daily they make their way to the synagogue. Watch as peasants stream into the square on market day and wait impatiently before the town well for cool water that will bring relief on a hot summer day. No one in Kolbashova was a stranger to me. I knew almost everyone's name, more often nickname, and most people's stories, the respectable and the wretched, the devout and those beginning to doubt, Jews and Poles alike. The days of my youth I spent among them all, ever curious, insisting on being at the center of things. From them I learned about the world, even as we were, all of us in Kolbashova, set apart from it. In Kolbashova, he was known as Naftali Salishitz. We will know him as Norman Solzitz. According to Norman, about 95% of the Jewish population in Kolbashova was Orthodox. They believed that they were community that uniquely believed in God, were uniquely Orthodox, and in fact, a rabbi of some considerable note had lived in Kolbashova some years ago, and there was a belief that when the Mashiach came, when the Messiah came, he would probably first come to Kolbashova. In fact, there was a man in town who was known as Pinchas Mashiach. Why Pinchas Mashiach? Because he always, when he went to sleep, he always had his pants on and his shoes on. Pinchas, why do you have your pants and your shoes on? Because the Messiah could come at any time, and I simply wanted to be prepared. For most of these Jews, God was no afterthought. He was a daily presence. He defined their lives. He was not like often among us, religion is kind of compartmentalized. It is done on certain times, certain holidays, certain rituals. For them, it was a living presence. Even though they had to make certain clever improvisations to stay Orthodox. Here's one that Norman mentioned to me that I found quite charming. On Saturdays, you, of course, are not allowed to do any work. And it was a lovely town, and people enjoyed on Saturdays walking into the surrounding hinterlands and woods. But if you walked too far, it could be designated as work, and you were not allowed to work on the Sabbath. So what many of the Orthodox did, Friday night, they would go halfway to where they expected to walk, and under a tree, they would put some water and some bread. Why would they do that? By putting water and bread under the tree, that meant that it was now home to them. And therefore, when they went to the tree, they were back home. And then when they went beyond the tree and then back to the tree, you get what I'm saying. They did not walk too far because they had established a legitimate halfway point, which they could then call home. Prayers were a constant. It was part of daily living, acknowledging God at every time. Thank God, sprinkled virtually every conversation. On top of the letters that they wrote, they would always put a Beth and a Hey. Baruch Hashem, blessed is God. When they got up in the morning, of course, you all know, there was a prayer. Before drinking water, a prayer. If they were to drink another glass of water, a second prayer. Before going to sleep, putting on new clothes, the first blossoms of spring required a prayer. Lightning, thunder, rainbows, always a prayer. Minions started in that town around 4 a.m. There were a succession of minions. Why? Because many of them were merchants, businessmen who went off to other towns to sell their goods. They had to leave early, but they didn't want to miss the minions. So from 4 a.m. to 11 a.m., minions were conducted, as you'll see, in various locations. And often, Norman reported, they would go for a second minion. Why would they go for a second minion? Often they'd ask and answer to catch another Kedusha. They wanted to do Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh more than once in a given day. Purity was also a prime consideration. Water was near their bed. When they got up in the morning, they felt obliged and obligated to wash their fingers to purify them as they began their day. They went to the mikveh. There were 2 mikvehs in town. One was a mikveh that was really deep down. Norman said there were 35 steps below the initial mikveh. And not only did the women attend the mikveh, but the men did as well. The rabbi went there frequently, and the scribe, every time he was about to write the name of God in the parchment, he would go to the mikveh to purge himself before writing the name of God. Norman, for his bar mitzvah, went to the deepest mikveh, which was very, very cold, but very, very cleansing. Purity, the gartel. Every man who attended synagogue wore that belt around his waist to separate the higher functions, the mind, the heart, from the lower functions, the genitals and the excretions. Norman reported that around the synagogue, there were any number of outhouses. You were expected to relieve yourself before attending the services in the synagogue. And according to Norman, there was a frequency of hernias and hemorrhoids in the town because of the frequency with which men attended the outhouses before going to the synagogue. The synagogue, interestingly enough, was there, but was not always the center of religious observance. Just as important, as many of you have probably heard in other connections, were the shtibels, these little gatherings for the residents who would join a particular shtibel. Some of them were conducted in homes, in halls, in sections of the synagogue. The rabbi, for example, rarely showed up in the temple because he had his own shtibel in his own house where his followers would attend. The rabbi showed up at the synagogue only on special occasions, on Rosh Chodesh and on Simchat Torah. But beyond that, he generally, as I said, conducted his services in his own shtibel. You bought your seats in the temple. You remember Tevye saying that if he only could afford it, he would buy a seat next to the eastern wall. Well, seats next to the eastern wall went for a higher price. Seats next to the Aron Kodesh went for a higher price. They were passed down over the generations, and obviously that was a big deal. Aliyahs were also a big deal. Part of the rabbi's obligation was when a dispute arose as to who was entitled to an aliyah, the rabbi was also often called upon to adjudicate in those instances. The rules were if you had a yahrzeit coming up the following week, you were entitled to an aliyah. If you had held an aliyah for 3 years in a row, that became yours. So that there were various formal and informal rules regarding that. There were no sermons delivered in the synagogue. There were, as you will see, study groups that many people attended. They all knew the stories, they all knew the background, and as a result, sermons were not part of the service. There was a rabbi, as I said, and an assistant rabbi, known as the Dayan. His name was Mendel Rubin. The rabbi was Yechiel Teitelbaum, who was the son of a previous rabbi in town. What is rather interesting is that rabbinical leadership was passed on within the family, not the kind of search committee that we've had. So the father of Yechiel was rabbi. He then became the other rabbi, the next rabbi. He was beloved, but he was not considered a scholar. He was not considered a wise man. Problem with Yechiel was that he had gone to Cheder with all the other people in town, and they remembered he was kind of a dull, lackluster student, and therefore no one who could lead them in interpretations. The rabbi had to be particularly careful when walking through the streets. He had to be accompanied by the shamus, lest he walk between two women. The shamus had to guide him past rather compromising circumstances. He couldn't talk to the women. He could, of course, not shake their hand. So what functions did this rabbi have? He presided at circumcisions, he presided at weddings, but he did not preside at burials. Burials were conducted by the burial society in town. But he did have other functions, particularly settling disputes of all sorts. Rather than go into the courts, the Jews of the town felt more comfortable going to the rabbi to have these disputes settled, who usually operated with a rabbinical court and who usually called upon scholars to help when there were disputes that were rather complex. What the rabbi's primary function in this town was to help women determine what was kosher and where there might be potential violations of the kosher rules, because keeping a kosher home was a principal obligation of the women of Kol B'Shova. You didn't have to have an appointment. If you had a question about kosher, you left your home, you went to the rabbi, no appointment. He would sit down and listen to your question and render an answer. If your milk splattered on a pot that normally was used for meat, the rabbi had to resolve that. If you mistakenly put a butter knife into a dish that was used for meat, the rabbi had to resolve that. If you found a nail in the stomach of a goose, rabbi had to figure out how best to resolve that. How to kosher your pots, your pans, your utensils. So the rabbi did have a principal function there, not spiritual, but more disputations. In that town, there was a long-standing rift between the rabbi and the assistant rabbi, known as the Dayan, even though they were cousins. They were jealous of one another, and it came to a head, according to Norman, one Simchas Torah, when the rabbi was dancing around with the Torah, a follower of the assistant rabbi rushed up to the rabbi and grabbed the Torah out of his hands. That led to a dispute, needless to say, led to years of litigation and years of dissension within the town. So the rabbi and the assistant rabbi created a schism that was not resolved for years to come. Interestingly, while there was a rabbi there, of course, what you found were illustrious rabbis who traveled through Eastern Europe, who had great reputations and who came to towns. They were like rock stars. They came to towns for weekends, they delivered sermons, they gathered their followers. And Norman's father was a strict adherent to one of these illustrious rabbis, and he would go off every so often for a weekend when the rabbi attended to a town nearby. And he got into trouble with his wife because she didn't like him leaving for weekends when there was so much to be done around the house, but he felt it necessary because of how illustrious this rabbi was, how a blessing it was to hear him preach. And of course, the apex of that meeting was a private session with that rabbi. And you would hand him a shetel. You'd write a question on a slip of paper, and the rabbi would render an opinion or a decision, and it was the highlight of the weekend. There were also cantors, itinerant cantors who went from town to town singing, and what Norman referred to as magids, itinerant preachers, who after services on Saturday, people would gather once again in the synagogue to hear his interpretation of one sort or another. But interesting and fascinating, and all of you of course know this, was the respect and reverence paid to scholars in that town, people of the book. You remember Tevye's fondest dream was he could sit in the synagogue and pray and listen to scholars and dispute the texts. That was the ultimate goal, and quite correctly, given what Norman tells us about these scholars. Let me read you what the point here was about the scholarship and the love of books and so forth. A scholar, that's what my father wished I would become. But I didn't see the point of it. Too much of it I viewed as splitting hairs, dwelling on minor points, mindlessly reciting the words of others. Most people, however, thought otherwise. There was no shortage of study groups whose members gathered together in earnest examination and careful consideration of the written word. Those who excelled at this, who were able to lead discussions and guide others, were much admired. How did we rate such people? The more authorities they could summon forth in support of their point of view, the more direct quotations they could invoke, the greater their ability to cite chapter, section, and page, the higher the esteem in which they were held. They might know little of the world around him, but they possessed the capacity to retain and expand upon an immense amount of information. My father never ceased to remind me about my friend Shlomo Greenstein, who, because he possessed such abilities, won a scholarship to the world-famous yeshiva in Lublin. If I had been able to follow Shlomo's footsteps, nothing would have made my father prouder. It was a remarkable phenomenon. Here we were, mostly a poor people, living in a small remote town amidst a Polish population that had little or no interest in such matters. And still, our faith in books remained unshakable. They were our strength, our solace, our salvation, the tangible products of the tradition that bound us together with endless past generations. Books also offered a path to prestige and community esteem. A real scholar, that was the highest praise we could bestow on a person, instantly transforming him in the eyes of others, replacing economic standing, the usual means of judgment, with a more elevated standard of worth. It was remarkable that an impoverished man, a man barely able to survive, the kind of person who might otherwise attract sympathy but never respect, could be given a place of honor in our community because of his piety and learning. Men poor beyond description were admired and consulted because of what they knew and because of their immense commitment to their faith. Where else were humble and otherwise obscure persons accorded such respect and looked for guidance? Rather remarkable, the role of the scholar. And as you know, we'll talk about this later, was an honor. When it came to marriage, normally class lines were adhered to, with the exception you could, if you were well-to-do, middle class, upper middle class, although there were not that many of them there, you could marry a poor scholar because of the prestige that the scholar conferred upon the family, and that scholar would be taken into the house and supported. You remember from Shtetl, where the young girl is attracted to the scholar, and they end up marrying in the Shtetl movie. So the role of scholar is quite significant. What about women in Kol B'Shova? An unmarried women did not have to attend synagogue except on Yom Kippur. Married women had to attend only on Saturday, and they sat upstairs. There was a partition, there was a mechitza. The only time women were able to come down was on Simchat Torah, where they stood on the periphery and watched the men dance around with the Torah. You know the story. Women's voices would be a distraction. Seeing women would be a distraction. It's kind of like those Greek myths with the sirens luring men onto the rocks. And so the women, as none of you are surprised, was segregated. And there was also that prayer that was said, thank God I was not born a woman. And I asked Norman about that. How did he explain it? Was it male chauvinism? And obviously, to a degree, it was. But Norman's take was that it reflected the joy that men felt that they had so many more opportunities to display their love of God. Women were not given these because they were left on the periphery. So to be a man was to have the opportunity on so many other occasions, particularly in the synagogue, to express their love of God. So women were largely absent from synagogue, except for one dramatic event, which I'm about to read you about, which shocked me when I first heard it, and I think you'll find it rather startling when you see the dimensions of it. For dramatic effect, there was nothing like what happened from time to time when, with services underway, a woman would burst into our midst, rush up to the Holy Ark, thrust it open, and begin a lengthy emotional appeal, not to us, mind you, but to God. However irregular the scenes, and only those present could appreciate the extraordinary impact it had, it was accepted practice. The woman was there on a desperate mission to intercede with God on behalf of a critically ill relative. There she was, alone in front of all those men, pleading in Yiddish with all the emotion she could summon, praying for a miracle. Her dramatic entry and presence was enough to stop whatever else might be happening. No one would ever dare deny her, no matter that she brought our service to an abrupt halt. Some women could not muster the courage to act in such a bold and uncharacteristic manner. Actually, it was surprising that so many could. Those who could not do it found others prepared to act in their place. No matter who appeared, it was an extraordinary scene. A silent hall, attention riveted on the lone, distraught woman, alternately crying, shrieking, and begging for God's intervention. Why was God bringing down such pain and distress? Did he not recognize how righteous and worthy the person was? What would become of the family? When the case was made, the pleas directed to God, the emotions completely discharged, it was over. As quickly as the woman appeared, she closed the ark and left. And in a moment, the service resumed. Even though this happened with some regularity, it never failed to send all who witnessed it to send a shiver through everyone present. He then went on to note that these women then usually went on to the Jewish cemetery in town and prayed for the intercession of relatives to help in this instance. And also, and maybe you're familiar with this ritual, I wasn't, to the people who were sick, ailing, they would attach, I'll read what he said, to his existing name. A male would have Alta, old one, or Chaim added, a female, Alta and Chaya added to their name. Might the addition of such a name make long life more likely for those so gravely affected? All prayed it would be so. A very interesting ritual, you would agree.
Richard,
Yeah.
it was used because it was hoped that the addition of the name would confuse the angel of death.
I think you're probably right.
And often it was used especially with ill children, because if someone was very young, to put the name Alta, which means old to them, it was totally confusing. Chaim, that was often used for lengthening, but Alta was often given to a young person to confuse the angel of death, because it was the antithesis.
I think you're right on target. I'm going to talk about how they celebrated certain of the holidays. The most fascinating, of course, has to do with the high holidays, particularly with Yom Kippur. The men would gather that afternoon and early evening at the synagogue. There would be hay placed on the ground. The men would, one by one, kneel on the hay, where they would then be whipped by the sexton, 5 or 6 whippings per each man. Then they would, as we're often instructed to do, ask to be forgiven among those who had gathered at the synagogue. And before entering the synagogue, there'd be a long table with trays on them, where the various Jewish organizations in town put collection plates to collect money for their activities. Books for the synagogue, the Free Loan Society, widows, orphans, the Burial Society, for the dowry of poor women. So as you went into the synagogue, you would put coins in these various collection plates. Then when you entered the synagogue, as you were entering, the kids would take the hay and put them next to where their fathers would be standing for the Yom Kippur service, because the fathers entered without shoes and without socks for the entirety of the Yom Kippur service for the next 24 hours. they would stand for Kol Nidre, and they would stand for 24 hours in a row. They did not speak, at least many of them would not speak Yiddish during Yom Kippur. It was considered too common a language. Instead, those who could spoke Hebrew for the duration of the service. They then brought in 3-foot candles, and they placed them on a table in front of each of them. Those 3-foot candles were lit, and they provided the only source of illumination for the service. So you can imagine no lights, the aroma of the candles, the smoke of the candles, men standing in their kittles, in their talit, in their black coats. It was quite a scene. Norman loved, when he was a kid, he loved Yom Kippur because he ran around all over the place with what he called shmekets, a bottle of ammonia. Because given the fact that people were fasting, given the smoke in the room, many people felt faint. He would run up to where the women were and let them smell the ammonia. He would run among the men. His role during Yom Kippur was to distribute the shmekets for those in attendance. A brief note on Tisha B'Av. What is fascinating is, of course, they observed it very seriously. Men did not shave for 3 weeks prior to it. They ate no meat. They fasted, of course, on the day. They wore old clothes. But what I did want to point out is that on the day of Tisha B'Av, all the kids of the town, the Jewish kids that is, came into the synagogue and threw bricks along the floor. Norman, why in the world would these kids be throwing bricks along the floor? Norman's answer, tradition. I have no idea. We can speculate, the bricks, of course, having to do with the destruction of the temple. Maybe that was the connection. But Norman was unable to really supply an explanation that made much sense. Again, there's much more that of the other holidays, particularly Passover, that I would like to discuss with you. Time, however, is growing short. And I'd like to conclude, after having regaled you with the orthodoxy of the 95% of the population, Norman is smart enough and wise enough to conclude on 2 notes. The first one having to do with how superstitious were these people despite their commitment to Jewish orthodoxy. For all our deeply held religious faith and commitment to learning, we were still in certain ways a plain, isolated, unsophisticated people. Among other things, we were receptive to folk beliefs and superstitions, though to a lesser degree than the surrounding Polish population. We would not cross the path of a black cat, walk under a ladder, be indifferent to a broken mirror, or avoid cures that were more superstition than science. Talismans were seen as potent objects. Numbers were scrutinized for their significance. The evil eye was a living presence among us. To praise a child, for example, might be tempting fate, so we were quick to spit 3 times in order to avert any evil consequences. When it thundered, we went quickly to place a cup of water on the windowsill as a form of protection. We were sure that Ashmedai, the king of the evil spirits, and his wife, Lilith, were out in the world opposing all that we held dear. No one doubted that Ashmedai would attempt to strangle a newborn Jewish male the night before his circumcision to prevent a further addition to the Jewish people. On what we called watch night, the mother and baby were closely guarded to prevent this from happening. At the wedding ceremony, the bride walked around the groom under the chuppah 7 times as a precaution to thwart the designs of Ashmedai, who it was believed wished to prevent the marriages of Jewish couples. We worshiped Almighty God, but we were also wary of evil spirits who inhabited our world and attempted to disrupt our lives. Norman also concludes this chapter by saying that things were changing. Modern ideas were coming into play in the middle and late 30s. He tells a story about how his father got into a fight with his sister-in-law because she was starting to wear portions. She would not cut off her hair. Women were beginning to use makeup. Men were smoking cigarettes. Other women were beginning not to want to use matchmakers. In short, as always is the case, I mean, Tevye was lamenting this as well. What is happening? The world is changing. Of course, Tevye takes place in 1905. Our story of Kol B'Shova takes place in the 1930s, but there is still obviously an effort to retain tradition, even though the world is changing and people are obviously at least part of it. And Norman was one of them. He's a remarkable character who followed the traditions and yet was uncomfortable with them, and had things changed and had the Germans not come in, things would have been might different. But of course, how this would have ended up, what changes would have taken place, how the community would have evolved will be a source of speculation, because as all you know, in 1939, in September, the Germans swept into his town, and the Holocaust and all the grim disasters that we're all familiar with you began. And therefore the story of Kol B'Shova ends, it is destroyed, very few survivors, Norman among them, and we have his precious memories to remind us of the story of this little, well, wasn't so little a village. It was a village, I neglected to tell you, of about 4,000 people, approximately 2,000 Jews and 2,000 Poles. And the relationship of the two groups would be a source for additional conversation sometime later. But before I go, I'm curious if there are at least aspects of what I said or what I didn't say that you might wish to bring up or comment upon.
Richard, whatever you do, just please give us more, because this was fascinating.
Well, what I have, if we can schedule another session, is marriage and matchmakers, the role of Palestine and the United States in that community. So yeah, there's obviously, I just gave you the substance of one chapter on the religious practices of the community, but there is more, and I'll speak to Joy and see what we can arrange and pursue that.
Richard, I want to add that a copy of your, or 2 copies of your book are in the library at Temple, and maybe the next time that you do this, you can share a little bit about our visit to Kol B'Shova and how that came about. But I know time is short now, so not for today.
Yeah, Louise and I did visit Kol B'Shova. The synagogue is probably the only structure that remained no longer a synagogue. It's a, well, I'm not sure. It's a
Looked like a school. Yeah.
School, a museum. It's changed its function over the years. There was, as of 2006, one Jew left who subsequently passed on. So it is still there. Kolbashova, in the time that I wrote about it, had a population of about 4,000. Now I'm told it's a population of 9 to 10,000. So it's still around, but of course the Jewish flavor has totally disappeared. Although interestingly, it qualified for the restoration of the Jewish cemetery, and funds have come forth from the United States to help restore at least elements of the cemetery in that town. So it does still speak to us, at least in that fashion.
Thank you, Richard.
Did Norman have a trade? Did he learn a trade, or
Well,
was
he
he
in
learning?
our story, he's born in 1920. He goes
Right.
into the woods in 1941.
Oh, he was still. a
Yeah,
kid.
he would then come to America and
Right.
succeed mightily as in real estate. I mean, his after story is
Yeah.
just
Okay.
as fascinating as his story of survival and his story of the village that he inhabited. So there are many Norman stories, and given his extraordinary ability to recall people and places, and episodes,
The
he
treasure.
has kept us informed about that world, which we saw in Fiddler, but this is kind of an update and a bit more realistic than what we are accustomed to. But still, as I said, the parallels are many and fascinating.
And his father, do we know what his father did for a
Yeah.
living? Or?
They were well-to-do. They owned
Oh,
a wholesale shop in town, and therefore did rather nicely. One of the big deals in that town was Market Day.
mhm.
And we actually have, if we pursue this, and I'll speak to Joy, someone in 1935 came back from one of the benevolent societies in the United States, which were constantly sending money over, as you know, in order for many of them to even have much of a Passover. They relied on funds coming from the United States to help them purchase various items for Passover. In any event, the folks in the United States sent a videographer to Kolbashova in 1935, and we have a picture of life as he recorded it, mostly on Market Day. And I have one of the pictures. This is a picture, if you can see it, of the Melamed and his kids coming out of Cheder. The Melamed obviously is the tall individual, and all the kids coming out of Cheder. I think it was taken from the video that was shot. So as I said, Norman was a photographer.
Richard, do you remember what day Market Day occurred on?
Tuesdays.
Thank you.
Every different town had Market Day. Obviously, they plotted this out. They had Market Day on different days so that you could come and shop. And if you were a merchant, you could go to Kolbashova Tuesday and Zheshau on Wednesday, et cetera, et cetera. Those pictures of Market Day are astounding. I mean, the size of the marketplace was overwhelming. The number of people who flooded in was exceptional. So it was the lifeblood of the town. Otherwise, the town virtually was totally quiet, except for people scrambling to go to the temple any other time of the week.
What part of Poland was this? Where
It was about 2 hours by car east of Krakow.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Louise and I hired a car, and they drove us there, and we'll talk about it. But it turns out that Louise had relatives who came from a town not far from there. So we were able remarkably to go to 2 towns within easy driving distance on the same excursion. And then, talk about coincidences. When we bought a house up in the Berkshires many, many years ago, we were driving to it, and it's in the woods, and there are not too many people around. And just before we got to our house, we saw on the tree a plaque. And the name on the plaque was Solzitz. 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 Who in the world would ever imagine that from Poland to the Berkshires, within the space of, you tell me how many years. Now, of course, this wasn't Norman. Norman passed away in 2006, but this was the son of his brother, who remarkably enough bought a house next to ours
Wow.
in Massachusetts.
Unbelievable.
Absolutely unbelievable when you talk
Great.
about coincidences. And
Make
then
the
the earlier one I told you about the Benevolent Society from Kolbashova having established its room or meeting hall, I'm not sure which, 1 block away from where I grew up on 4th Street. They were located on 5th Street. So coincidences.
Talk about other coincidences. A close colleague of mine, a former student and close colleague, turns out his relatives were from Kolbashova. So he was absolutely thrilled. He had researched Richard's book, and remember Rich Howard? And called and said, this can't be, that you wrote about where my grandparents came from. And so there were all these kind of 6 degrees of separation. That
It's a small world.
yeah.
Yeah.
Jewish world, that's for sure.
So thank you all for joining in. I hope you
Thank you,
found something
Richard.
of
Thank
interest.
you so
Richard,
much.
we'll definitely be doing this again. We'll keep everyone posted.
Thank you,
This is great.
Richard.
Oh, yeah, nice to
Thank
see
you,
all of
Joy.
you. You stayed in your little boxes. You saw who your neighbors were. And it was a delight seeing all of you joining together.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Bye.
Bye, Richard.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody.
Be well, stay safe.
Yes.
Okay.
Bye.